My world, it moves so fast today. The past, it seems so far away.
America sends its kids to school. They are unaware that they are being prepared for war. America pays no attention to the schools being formed into military facilities. White Americans are so blinded by Trump's racism, they don't even see their own deaths.
BuzzFeed dug up an old quote from Donald Trump talking about a large-scale terror attack 19 months before 9/11. In his 2000 book, The America We Deserve, Trump wrote, "I really am convinced we're in danger of the sort of terrorist attacks that will make the bombing of the 1993 Trade Center look like little kids playing with firecrackers." Trump also mentioned the mastermind of the attack, writing, quote, "One day, we're told that a shadowy figure with no fixed address named Osama bin Laden is public enemy number one, and U.S. jet fighters lay waste to his camp in Afghanistan. He escapes back under some rock, and a few news cycles later, it's on to a new enemy and a new crisis." Trump.
Wait.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on a second. Is this really Trump before 9/11? Have you read this?
It's 2000 in his book.
Are we making this? Did you make this up, Mika?
Nick.
I did.
Did you make this up?
Yeah,
Nick,
exactly.
tell us it's over, right? Because
Will
you're
you
wrong
stop?
about everything.
Mika, stop. God.
I don't think it's over.
What's that? What's the rage here? Will you stop
No,
picking
it's
on
cute.
him?
I think it's cute.
Well,
go for it.
no, really quickly, though. I mean, so Willie, that was
2000.
2000.
In a book he wrote in the year 2000. Yeah.
Well, it was published in 2000. He could have written in 1999 for all we know.
Exactly. He might have
But
been
he-
a bit more precious.
So he basically predicted the attacks from Osama bin Laden.
A Wall Street Journal investigation into Donald Trump's business career finds the GOP presidential nominee sometimes dealt with people connected to organized crime in his Atlantic City and New York real estate work. Joining us now to discuss is WSJ investigative reporter Michael Rothfeld. Hi, Michael. Great to see you.
Hi, Tanya.
First off, if you would give us a little bit of the story behind the story. How long did this investigation take? How many reporters were involved, and who did you talk to?
Well, it was primarily me and Ali Berzon, a reporter who works for us in California. We spent several months looking at documents, talking to people, kind of digging into various business associates of Donald Trump going back to probably late 70s, early 80s, and up through the present.
Wow, exhaustive. And then you found that in the early 80s, when an ambitious young Donald Trump was looking to extend his business into Atlantic City, he did have a sit-down meeting with FBI agents about it, correct? And what came out of that meeting?
That's right. Well, he was looking to open a casino in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He had primarily been working with his dad developing properties in New York City, and he wanted to know what kind of risks. My dad's business has a reputation, and I don't want to jeopardize that by going into Atlantic City. So he had someone he had met in Atlantic City who was an FBI informant, a guy named Dan Sullivan, who was a Teamster, and he introduced Trump to these FBI agents.
Oh, and the FBI agent said, you know what, Mr. Trump, might be better to stay out of Atlantic City, right?
Yeah, they said, you know, there's a lot of kind of shady people doing business down there, and the mob has some influence, and so there might be better ways you could invest your money if you're worried about your reputation.
Because this was Atlantic City in the 80s, and among builders, it was widely known that it was almost impossible to go down there without getting your hands at least a little dirty, it seems.
That's right. At the beginning, banks wouldn't even really work down there, so it was something people stayed away from, but Donald Trump went forward nonetheless.
He did, and you found some specific people that he dealt with. I'm going to start with the first, who was a man described by prosecutors as an agent of the Philadelphia mob. Is that right?
Right. This was a guy named Ken Shapiro, and he was a scrap metal dealer in Philadelphia, and he also worked with the Philadelphia mob and the mob boss at the time, Nicky Scarfo, who they called Little Nicky. And he and the other gentleman I just mentioned, Dan Sullivan, the Teamster, who knew Trump, owned a piece of property together, and Trump needed it to build his first casino, so they leased it to him.
All right. So then you also found a connection later or around the same time with a gambler who was convicted of tax fraud?
Right. That was a gentleman named Robert Labuti. He was what's known as a high roller, and he basically spent a lot of money at the casinos. He was a horse trader. He was banned from racetracks in New York State, and Trump got to know him because, you know who your big customers are who are bringing a lot of money into your casinos.
Yeah, you found he personally spent $11 million in the Trump casinos?
That's right, yeah. And so Trump, I gave him some cars, and that those were turned into cash pretty quickly.
And they did have a personal relationship. His daughter confirmed that Trump attended one of her birthday parties,
Yeah,
correct?
she told Yahoo News that when I went out to New Jersey to interview her, but she kind of ran into her garage when I went to talk to her.
Oh, really?
So she did tell Yahoo News that Trump went to her birthday party.
Okay, and then you also found there was a connection with a union leader who was convicted of racketeering as well?
Right. Well, in the construction industry in general, to be fair, the mob controlled a lot of the construction trades in New York, and basically in that time period. So if you're a developer, it's hard to avoid them. And they controlled the cement companies, the concrete companies, and also the unions.
But some builders and developers, as you pointed out, would use a middleman, and Trump didn't like doing
Right. Well, the general contractor would normally deal with some of those people, like the guy you're referring to, John Cody, was a Teamsters leader whose workers delivered cement to the construction sites, and so he would threaten. He was later convicted of racketeering, and he was tied. He had close relationships with Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano, who were mafia leaders in New York, and so he would threaten the developers with calling a strike if they didn't do what he wanted. And Trump, dealt with him directly also as well.
And then more recently, he had dealings with a real estate developer who was convicted of some sort of stock fraud that was connected to the mafia?
Right. This was a guy named Felix Sater, and Trump in the 2000s started a relationship with this company called Bayrock Group, and they developed a number of buildings. Basically, Trump started using his name for branding on buildings where he wouldn't build them, but he would lend his name and then get an ownership stake. So Bayrock did that with Trump Soho and some other buildings, and Felix Sater worked there. Sater had been convicted in the early 90s in a bar fight and lost his license as a stockbroker, and then later was involved in a pump and dump scheme that the mafia was involved in. They provided protection. Pump and dump is when you drive up the prices of stocks and then you sell them after people buy them. So you make money that way, and the mafia was offering protection for that. So Sater had relationships there, and then he went to work with Trump at Bayrock.
After that, right. Okay, so now, did you ask Trump about each of these connections, and what did he say?
Yeah, we did. Generally speaking, he says that either he didn't know about the connections, or if he knew that there might have been a story, he didn't really have a close relationship with them, but primarily he's a businessman, and so, he wasn't running for office at the time. He didn't feel like there was anything that compromised him, and he had to work with certain people. He said that some of the mob tied construction companies were very good at doing concrete. They could do 3 floors in a week.
Right.
So
he didn't express any regret over these.
No, not at all. He said, "I'm the cleanest guy there is." In fact, and when I was in his office and talking to him, he had his kids in there. He had Ivanka in there, and said, "Ivanka, have you ever seen any mobsters in my office?" And she was like, "No, I've never seen any mobsters in your office." So
it was a family meeting.
Yes, exactly.
You got into the inner sanctum.
Yeah. His son Eric said the same thing. "I've never seen any mobsters in your office."
So there you have it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
All right.
Great
Thank
work.
you. Thanks for having me.
A plea hearing deal for the former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. The expectation is he will plead guilty.
Even as special counsel Robert Mueller's Trump-Russia investigation racks up guilty pleas and cooperating witnesses, President Trump maintains a consistent line of defense.
It's a witch hunt. That's all it is. There was no collusion with Russia, if you can believe this one.
Nobody has shown he conspired with Russia in 2016. And no one knows whether Robert Mueller will ever make such an accusation. But he's getting help from Trump's former national security advisor, deputy campaign chief, and campaign foreign policy advisor, all of whom have admitted felonies. A long trail of interactions with Russians already sits in plain sight. Trump relied on Russian money long before he ran for president. His partners in the 2006 Trump Soho project in New York included a former official of the Soviet Union and a Russian who confessed to felony fraud involving organized crime. In 2008, his son Donald Trump Jr. said money was pouring in from Russia for Trump properties. The same year, a Russian oligarch paid Trump $95 million for a Florida mansion Trump bought in 2004 for less than half that price. Showcasing a family golf course in 2013, Eric Trump told a journalist that Russian sources provided financing that American banks would not. Later, Donald Trump took his Miss Universe pageant to Moscow.
You have a special announcement where the Miss Universe pageant will be held this year. Go ahead.
Are you ready? The Miss Universe pageant will be held at Crocus City Hall in Moscow, Russia.
And he openly courted Russian President Vladimir Putin. Through his lawyer, Michael Cohen, Trump sought to develop real estate in Moscow while running for president.
The stuff in Ukraine is shady. You were on like the wrong side of a people's revolution that the United States is trying to support now.
In the country, I was the guy who negotiated the deal that brought them into Ukraine, into Europe.
As his 2016 campaign chief, Trump chose Paul Manafort, who lived in Trump Tower and got tens of millions of dollars from Putin allies in Ukraine. As national security advisor, Trump chose Michael Flynn, who got $45,000 to join Putin at this December 2015 dinner in Moscow. As foreign policy advisors, he named 30-year-old George Papadopoulos and Carter Page, who'd been identified by U.S. officials as a potential Russian spy.
Were you in email chains with Papadopoulos?
Probably a few, yeah.
Were you in email chains with him about Russia?
It may have come up from time to time. Again, there's nothing major, yeah.
Soon after becoming a Trump advisor, Papadopoulos communicated with a professor in London who said Russians had email dirt on presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. Weeks later, Russians sent word that they had dirt on Clinton directly to Donald Trump Jr. He replied, "I love it," and arranged a June meeting at Trump Tower. Manafort and Jared Kushner joined him at that meeting with a Russian lawyer linked to the Kremlin. After that, Democratic Party emails that U.S. intelligence agencies say were stolen by Russia were publicly released by front groups. Trump publicly asked Moscow for more.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
Then in August, Trump's friend Roger Stone predicted trouble for Clinton aide John Podesta. And weeks later, Podesta's stolen emails were also released. Throughout the campaign, Trump spoke warmly of Putin.
We're going to have a great relationship with Putin and Russia.
But his campaign ridiculed the idea that Russia might be interfering in the election to help him, even after Donald Jr.'s Trump Tower meeting in June.
Well, it just goes to show you their exact moral compass. I mean, they'll say anything to be able to win this. I mean, I can't think of bigger lies, but that exactly goes to show you what the DNC and what the Clinton camp will do. They will lie and do anything to win.
After the election, American intelligence officials declared that's exactly what Russia had done. Trump accused those officials of unfairly targeting him. Trump's vice president denied any campaign contacts with Russians.
Of course not. Why would there be any contacts between the campaign?
And he also said that Flynn's post-election conversations with the Russian ambassador had nothing to do with sanctions imposed by President Barack Obama.
I talked to General Flynn yesterday, and the conversations that took place at that time were not in any way related to new U.S. sanctions against Russia or the expulsion of diplomats.
Now Flynn has sworn under oath that was a lie. And when the Trump Tower meeting with Russians became public in 2017, the president himself helped draft a statement concealing its purpose.
In the case of Don, he listened. I guess they talked about, as I see it, they talked about adoption and some things. Adoption wasn't even a part of the campaign. But nothing happened from the meeting. Zero happened from the meeting.
He fired FBI Director James Comey over the Russia investigation.
When I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story.
Then immediately told Russian diplomats that had taken the pressure off. The president hasn't directed his national security team to hit back hard at Russia with a cyber counterattack.
I believe that President Putin has clearly come to the conclusion there's little price to play here.
Bingo.
And that therefore I can continue this activity.
Yes.
Will President Trump pay a price? The list of prosecution targets has drawn closer to Trump. Prosecutors have now seized evidence from Cohen, his personal lawyer. The Swiss pharmaceutical giant Novartis now admits it paid more than $1 million to Cohen's company, even though it knew Cohen wasn't helping their interests in Washington. AT&T has acknowledged paying $600,000. At both companies, executives linked to those payments have left their jobs. The company they paid is the one Cohen used to pay hush money to porn star Stormy Daniels. Who else paid Cohen's company? The investment firm Columbus Nova, run by the cousin of Russian billionaire Viktor Vekselberg, who's close to Vladimir Putin. Not only did Vekselberg attend that December 2015 dinner with Putin and Flynn, he also attended Trump's inauguration as president. So did Natalia Veselnitskaya, the Russian lawyer who 7 months earlier had met with top Trump campaign officials at Trump Tower. President Trump's final line of defense remains intact. He has not been charged with any crime. In congressional testimony released in May 2018, his son Donald Trump Jr. said, "I did not collude with any foreign government and did not know anyone who did." But neither Congress nor Robert Mueller has interviewed President Trump yet.
Earlier this week, we reported a new milestone crossed in the war in Afghanistan. The number of U.S. military deaths has surpassed 2,000. Ray has the story behind the numbers.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
In 2001, President George W. Bush launched Operation Enduring Freedom. More than a decade later, the U.S. is still fighting in Afghanistan, and Americans are still dying. While the numbers vary, the Department of Defense and others count at least 2,000 American military deaths since the war began. The number includes suicides in Afghanistan, but not those following service there.
Where they're shooting at, I want you to shoot at.
The death toll surpassed 1,000 back in 2010. That figure then doubled in just over 2 years after a major escalation.
I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan so that they can target the insurgency and secure key population centers.
What was called the Surge sent more troops into dangerous Taliban territory. Philip Carter, a senior fellow with the Center for a New American Security, served 9 years as an Army military police and civil affairs officer, including 1 year in Iraq.
It's a very infantry-centric war.
Carter says that jump in deaths is easy to understand when you look at the increase in the numbers, what the surge forces were asked to do, and where.
The fighting is concentrated in those places in Afghanistan that are most difficult to fight in. The plains of Helmand, where we're really talking about canal to canal or house to house fighting. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan, where we see bloody combat reminiscent of Vietnam or in some cases even of Korea. Very difficult to evacuate troops from if they're hurt, and that results in a high number of casualties for those troops committed to those areas.
The rising death toll also shed light on one military branch's role in the war.
Most of these casualties in that second thousand occurred in the south, and that's where some of the most bloody fighting against the Taliban occurred. It's also where the Marine Corps put the majority of its effort, and I think that's why the Marines disproportionately suffered more dead than the Army or the Navy or the Air Force.
The website iCasualties.org lists two southern provinces, Helmand and Kandahar, as those with the most coalition fatalities during the war. Department of Defense data also shows the majority of Americans killed were white men. Most were active duty soldiers as opposed to reservists, and between 25 and 30 years old. Still, the American death toll in Afghanistan is less than half that from the war in Iraq. The U.S. military effort there ended in December 2011.
In Iraq, you had a much larger force go in a much more violent way initially than you had in Afghanistan. And then that large force stayed for year after year after year with 120, 150,000 troops on the ground. Iraq was, for a long time, emphasized as the main effort. and Afghanistan was always seen as the supporting effort, and that drove the resourcing for that war. It also, I think, drives the casualty numbers, that we're only now reaching the place in Afghanistan that we reached in Iraq many years ago.
Carter says the face of today's military force in Afghanistan is also much different, particularly when it comes to women, 36 of whom were killed in Afghanistan.
Women have served our country extraordinarily well in Afghanistan, and they have served alongside with, and in some cases died alongside with, their male colleagues and brethren. When it comes to serving in combat and serving in particularly arduous conditions where you could be killed, gender fades away, and it's all about whether you can do the job or whether you can't.
As the war in Afghanistan enters its 11th year, U.S. military forces have begun to draw down, with Afghan forces taking full control of security by the end of 2014. But some fear those Americans on the ground today may be forgotten.
Good afternoon.
Last week, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta called for the country's renewed attention.
I thought it was important to remind the American people that there is a war going on in Afghanistan, and that young men and women are dying in order to try to protect this country.
The Afghan people are in the crossfire of those same battles, and Afghan security forces are seeing more deaths in their ranks. Civilian casualties have gone down this year compared to 2011, but remain high. The United Nations reported just under 3,100 Afghan civilians were killed or wounded through June, 30% of them women and children.
People generally forget the mistakes of the past. Citizens who are caught up in Hitler's Nazi Germany hardly notice the gradual development of extremism, mainly due to high emotions and dazzling propaganda. But history often repeats itself. Plastic coffins, detention centres, armoured checkpoints, and armoured military vehicles for civil purposes are well-documented facts. Witnesses who have worked for the United States military claim stores of guillotines located in Fort Lewis military facility. The latest revelation of Obamacare sanctions death by guillotine, code ICD-9E-978. However, Obama was only following the mandate of the World Health Organization, one of the specialized agencies under the United Nations. The United States government getting ready for a fascist quasi-dictatorship involving forced religion. It would not be the first time that fascism and counterfeit Christianity have merged.
When it's dark outside, cold as hell, and you starving on the inside, no one can tell what's really in your mind, heaven or hell. With death as a thought, you already fell.
The 9/11 attack on America looked so much like a formula action-packed Hollywood disaster movie that it had "Made in the USA" written all over it. The only difference is it used real props and real people. It had terrorist villains, American firefighter heroes, fireball explosions, collapsing buildings, pedestrians chased by dust clouds, and it even had a God Bless America music score. Well-positioned cameras shot the action-packed drama from every conceivable angle.
Just a picture of the helicopter landing and the president walking in. 19 hijackers of the Saudi nationals. So in the terrible, he said that he didn't believe that Osama bin Laden.
No one has blamed or accused him formally.
But how many people worked in the city is confirming that some 265 firefighters are believed. None of us will ever forget this day.
America remembers Sunday 82.
But it doesn't take an Enron accountant to figure out who's cashing in. During the first week, the 911 producers made a spectacular fortune just on the stock market alone. How? By knowing in advance that the stocks in airline and insurance companies associated with the 911 crash would fall in value. Using that inside information, they made negative bets on the stock market called put options. Put options are bets that a certain stock will fall in value by a certain date. It's big risk gambling, unless you've got inside information that can turn your bet into a sure thing. But that's illegal if you get caught at it.
You wanna accuse my brother, read my mother, kill my father, tell my sister you love her. You wanna accuse my brother, read my mother, kill my...
And you starving on the inside, no one can tell what's really in your mind, heaven or hell. With death as a thought, you already fell.
For those who are unfamiliar with the Jesuit order, it was the Catholic answer to counteract the Reformation sparked in 1517. Loyola Ignatius's formula for the formation of the Jesuits was approved by Pope Paul III in 1540. Napoleon Bonaparte had this to say about the Jesuit order. The Jesuits are a military organization, not a religious order. Their chief is the general of an army, not the mere father abbot of a monastery. And the aim of this organization is power in its most despotic exercise. Absolute power, universal power to control the world by the volition of a single man. Jesuitism is the most absolute of despotism, and at the same time the greatest and most enormous of abuses. The general of the Jesuits insists on being master, sovereign, over the sovereign. Wherever the Jesuits are admitted, they will be masters, cost what it may. The society is by nature dictatorial. Therefore, it is the irreconcilable enemy of all constituted authority. Every act, every crime, however atrocious, is a meritorious work if committed for the interest of the society of the Jesuits or by the order of the general. The Vatican has historically used civil powers in past ages as she does today.
Donald Trump was an American president installed by the Jesuits into the American government. Donald Trump's mission is to destroy America from within. Donald Trump has made enemies around the world and is continuing to make enemies around the world against the United States government. Donald Trump has put the American citizens in harm's way and does not care about our lives.